Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans Reacts. And we have yet another follow up because if this drama ain't juicy enough, well, then we sure love beating the dead horse. Because now the Seattle Art Museum removes native objects amidst the federal rules. So this is a continuation of a story we've covered on a couple of different notable examples. Like we have covered the American Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum, but even Harvard's Peabody Museum and the Met in New York City have been affected by this. What happened? Well, on January 12th, new rules were put in place to expedite the return of Native American graves and grave goods. The Native American Graves and Repatriation Act of 1990, more specifically, is the law. And what that basically entails is if an institution, be that a museum, school, repository, university, etc., has any sort of artifacts that pertain to Native American graves, they are legally obligated to return that. And you might be wondering, okay, if that law went into place in 1990, why are institutions freaking out? Well, part of why the new rules were put into effect this year is institutions would historically drag their feet on repatriation. They didn't want to rescind control over the artifacts. They didn't want to give them back to the communities that they belonged to or the groups, and as such would just not do their proper due diligence, or they would claim that there is no cultural connection. Any number of reasons, they basically wouldn't return these sacred objects. Well, now we are seeing the day of reckoning. We are seeing all of these institutions that have long standing been ignoring these policies now quickly taking action and shutting entire wings of the museums down, closing down entire displays, gutting them.
Yeah, and the reason we are looking at the Seattle Art Museum here is because it's kind of a smaller scale version of what is happening with a lot of other major museums where entire wings are shutting down. In the Seattle Art Museum, there are only five artifacts that are in question. They are five sacred items which belong to the uh, Tlingit indigenous group of what is currently Southeast Alaska. They are three ceremonial headdresses, a dagger, and a staff. Uh, and so we're doing here with this one is we're looking at where it happens, where it's only a small number of artifacts. Now, one is always too many. With things like this, if you had even one, you should have gone through the repatriation process and come to some form of agreement to hold on to it. You know, years ago at this point. But it's important to look at the institutions where this isn't like closing down half of the museum, where it is something that would honestly be very manageable to do.
It
And that is the case here.
it also goes to show you what museums and institutions were the biggest offenders. Like the Seattle Art Museum, they had a few pieces and they're being impacted, but it's not to the same degree as the other museums that are shutting down entire displays and wings. And on the flip side of that coin, there are other Washington museums that weren't impacted, like the Tacoma Art Museum and Seattle's Museum of History and Industry, which had historically complied, and then the Washington State Historical Society and the Washington State History Museum are assembling an internal task force to identify any potential concerns. I know different places handle this differently. I know the state of Wisconsin has an entire section dedicated to repatriation. They built um, an entire ceremony room within their facility that is ventilated for smoke and all sorts of other things that the tribes had consulted and requested, and the state government of Wisconsin complied, and they have a really great relationship with repatriating things that are in their collections or that may have ended up in their collections. So you see the flip side of both coins. It is something that is very important and something that I personally feel very strongly about. A lot of these changes are happening specifically because the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, she was a former member of Congress in New Mexico and a registered member of the Pueblo of Laguna tribe. So she is a tribally enrolled member making decisions that directly impact tribal nations.
Yeah.
It's almost like when you put exceptionally qualified people in these positions that you start seeing actual meaningful changes.
Yeah. And one of the other things too, one of the reasons why we chose to look at this article in particular is it also includes a statement from the repatriation coordinator of the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture, um, wherein the coordinator explains that their museum, the Burke Museum, is not shutting anything down. It doesn't have to take any of its artifacts off display, and is one of the only museums where this is occurring because they have been compliant for years. They have gone out of their way to, come to agreements with the tribes on how to exhibit things and what can be exhibited. And the statement from the Patriot Court says you shouldn't be rushing to take things down in February, like all these institutions are, because we've known this was coming. People in the museum field have known that these changes were coming. This isn't a law that appeared on the books one day and wasn't there the day before. This was a slow process. You know, Deb Haaland has been in office for almost 4 years at this point. You had to have seen the writing on the walls, and anyone who didn't try to get ahead of it really kind of deserves what they have coming.
And something that I also think is very important to highlight, Justice McNeely, the Burke's assistant registrar and repatriation coordinator, is Inupiaq, so he is a tribal member.
Yep.
He is an indigenous person who is speaking or who works on behalf of connecting the artifacts to other indigenous people. And you notice how the museum had no repatriation issues because they followed the law as they should have. And there there's a point to be made that these laws, you made the comment that Holland has been in office for 4 years, and
Yeah.
that should be ample time. This law has been on the books for 34 years at this point, which is shocking to say about 1990. But it's been on the books for 34 years, and they still haven't done everything to the letter of the law.
Yeah.
The fact
Well,
that the law had to be reinforced via orders from the secretary just tells you how much these organizations were dragging their feet and intentionally not complying.
yeah. Yeah, because like if they were in fact complying, but it wasn't visible, then when Deb Haaland issued these orders, all of the museums would have just walked out with a stack of papers and go, look, see, here's where we got all these agreements from all these different tribes to do all the things that we are doing,
And
instead of blacklisting wings or taking even just a handful of artifacts off display like Seattle is doing.
I'm gonna have a very incendiary comment here,
Yeah.
but if you're upset by these changes, you either don't fully understand the entire scope of everything or don't realize that a lot of these artifacts were illegally sourced.
Yeah.
They quite literally use the verbiage stolen
Mm-hmm.
very often because it applies to a T here. These people went under the cover of darkness and were robbing graves. They were digging up human remains to steal artifacts like this just to put them in these institutions. They were coerced out. They were not ethically sourced.
Yeah, a number of them. It's not just the grave robbing of people digging up graves and stuff. A number of these were also taken at gunpoint, uh, which is armed robbery. I mean, so many things that end up in museums are war trophies, from basically anything the U.S. military was doing, from like 1865 to 1900.
Or the British. And the other argument that tends to be made quite often is that the institutions are the best place for these items, but that is not always the case. And to a point of there's um, a lot of ethical arguments that could be made, or like I hate to use the racist word here, but to think that communities are not capable of handling their own history in an appropriate manner has a lot of negative context with it. But even to that point, a lot of indigenous communities are building their own repositories.
Yeah.
I know I've helped a few tribal nations establish repositories so they can actually start accepting these and keep them in good conditions. And they want to be stewards and custodians of their own past. And I
Yeah,
think that's something that everyone should be on board with.
yeah. The issue at the core of this is not whether or not the true story of these people is told, but who is able to tell it. And if the only person who is allowed to tell that story is a person who has repeatedly shown a disregard for your well-being or your interests,
Or your
then
culture.
your true story is not being told. And that is where this law comes in. That is why this law needed to get these teeth, and that is why it should be seen as an almost universally good thing that this law is being enforced.
Yeah, and I think you
And
make a good point. This finally gives the law some teeth.
yeah, and I am someone who is very rarely going to say a law is almost universally good because it's a law. It was written by people. People make mistakes.
And
Uh,
on that note, I think that's a great point for us to wrap up because this is just a continuation of an ongoing dialogue, and I'm sure we're going to have a continuous amount of follow ups on these topics. But let us know what your thoughts are. Do you disagree with me? Do you think that these institutions should keep the artifacts? Do you think tribal nations should be included? Let us know. And we'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.